Welcome back. Today we are going to be discussing the book JOTT by Mary Rose Barrington. Can you hold that up, Carolyn? And can you read the subtitle for that one?
When Things Disappear and Come Back or Relocate and Why It Really Happens.
So this book is written by this lady, Mary Rose Barrington, who's a psychical researcher. You know what that means if you haven't heard about that. That's what there's still a society for psychical research, and it started like in the 1800s today they call it parapsychology, but it was basically, investigating mediums and afterlife phenomena and
it started roughly, I believe, in the 1880s, and it included some of the leading intellectuals of the day. I think one of the Huxley brothers was in there, William James was in there, a lot of really respected scientists.
and the big philosopher, I can't remember his name, but a British philosopher was involved. There was like Frederick M. Myers. He wasn't actually a scientist, he was a classicist, but he ended up writing and collaborating on some of the biggest kind of volumes of the time. Like his magnum opus was called The Human Personality, subtitle like and it's Life After Death or something. But it was mainly because that was his main goal. That was the goal of a lot of these guys originally, was to see if there was any evidence for life after death. But in the pursuit of that goal, the things that they studied were actually relevant for wider fields like psychology in general. Like William James had said of this book, The Human Personality by Myers, that it basically contained something like the whole of our subject matter. So basically, like everything that is relevant to psychology, because Myers would deal with all kinds of actual psychological phenomena that were kind of cutting edge at the time, or that psychology as a new science hadn't really gotten into. So things like the unconscious processes, dissociation, automatisms, like all kinds of weird, far out there stuff that's pretty mainstream nowadays, but that actually had an application in the world of like psychical research.
Well, not only that, I think they were trying to rescue a lot of these phenomena from the sphere of religion. Not that religion didn't have something to say for it, but it was a way of trying to place it on a footing of something as worthy of scientific inquiry. Also, at the time, they were sort of in combat with the Darwinists, who, for, let's see, 1850-ish to 1880-ish, so had for 20 years been making gains with this completely materialist point of view. And so this was their way of trying to counter them on the same scientific ground, so to speak.
Yeah, but the problem back then is the same as today, is that they've always been a minority and fighting against the mainstream and viewed as like crackpots. But like one of the things you learn when you actually start reading the papers and the books that these guys have published, because they're all like for the most part they're all respectable scientists, aside from the fact that they're interested in parapsychology, and that they actually a lot of their protocols that they've developed, especially since Rhine started parapsychology as a science, doing lab studies, essentially setting up experiments that way. Like the methodologies that they developed have actually influenced the way mainstream psychologists, make studies, and they were always trying to go for like double blind, triple blind studies as rigorous as possible. And unlike mainstream psychologists, the parapsychologists actually publish their bad results. So they publish everything. They share everything. Like in psychology, it's the publish or perish thing, where they only publish their good results, and they'll massage their results as much as possible in order to get the good results. Parapsychologists just put it all out there because they're held to a higher standard, and they hold themselves to a higher standard because they know that they're trying to demonstrate something that is seen as just crackpot nonsense.
Well, Mary Rose Barrington is a very interesting addition to this group. She was part of it quite early on. She was I believe an Oxford graduate as a lawyer. So all of her background is very much about evidence and proving evidence or discrediting evidence, and she makes her a really meticulous researcher. And she has been involved with him for a lifelong thing. And the hilarious thing about this book is that she is 92 and just published this. So this has been a lifelong pursuit. And I was reading it. You can tell her education had been kind of 19th century. She's very very literary in her presentation, very meticulous in the way that the Society for Psychical Research was. And for a little while, I thought I was reading something that was maybe republished from the 40s until I ran into her reference to the Hadron Collider. I was like, okay. And I looked her up on Wikipedia, and she is still kicking.
Yep. And she's got that, she's British, so she's got that kind of dry British humor there too, which is quite fun to read. But to get into what the book is actually about, like JOTT, J-O-T-T, is an acronym for just one of those things.
Right.
So the idea being that everyone's had the experience of, looking for their car keys, or they're holding something and they drop it, into the sofa or next to the sofa, and then you can't find it, right? You're looking for it. And most of the time, it just falls behind in a weird spot, behind one of the legs on your couch or something, and and you're looking for minutes, sometimes days, and then you find it there.
Right.
And so oftentimes it's just one of those things, right? You just write it off. And most of the time, probably when something like that happens, it is just because it's fallen in an out of the way place. But the examples that she's using here are far more intriguing than just that, because it's one of those things where you just kind of write it off because you drop something, and sometimes you actually lose it. So sometimes you'll drop something and you can't find it, and you say, oh, well, I guess it just went somewhere and I just couldn't find it, right? Because it's a cluttered room. It would take too long to actually find. You're looking for it and you just happen to not be able to find it. But the premise of the book is that sometimes there's more to it than that. Sometimes it isn't that simple, and she would argue that based on the evidence, based on the case studies, based on personal experience and the case studies, which she lists like a couple hundred of them, I think.
97.
Okay, so almost 100.
Yeah.
That sometimes objects actually do disappear. Like something strange happens to them. Kind of like, a missing 411, but for your keys or for your paintbrush. Right. And so some of the examples that she gives are pretty remarkable. And, like you said, she knows what she's doing. She's pretty serious. So she's not just taking little anecdotes here and there. These are cases that were often experienced by researchers themselves, people that would generally be trustworthy, and whose cases were investigated. And she'd interview them and get as many details as possible and talk to as many people as possible.
And she was very meticulous about her methodology, and probably for everyone she included in the book, she probably dropped 20 for lack of proper documentation. So,
well, just to give one example, there are several that are just really good, really interesting stories. I mean, usually I don't like reading books like this with just a long series of case studies. I kind of find it boring and repetitive. But all of them were interesting. It was quite a page turner reading this one. So just one example. This was a painter who was giving a painting lesson. So I guess, painting landscapes or something like that. So he had this shop front that was not being used, and so he used it as a studio. So a big wide open space with like linoleum, I think. And they had their two easels set up in the middle of the room, and he was demonstrating this one technique to his student using I think what he called an inch thick paintbrush. So a substantial brush. And so he was, painting and then accidentally dropped it. And he heard it hit the ground, and then he looked for it, where he looks down and looks for it, can't find it anywhere. It's not, it should be, it's just wide open space. There's nothing else on the floor. It's a totally empty building except for the chairs and these two easels and these two people in the room. And so he and his student both get on their knees. They're looking all over. They think, oh, well, maybe it rolled over to the side of the room. Nope. Well, the brush couldn't have rolled anyways. And there was no sound of it rolling. Like it should have been an obvious thing. You drop something that substantial, it should be somewhere. But it was nowhere. They never found it.
Well, what was also remarkable was the fact that neither of them mentioned any kind of paint being splashed on the floor. There was no evidence that this paint-filled huge brush had ever made it to the floor other than the sound.
Right. So just to give an idea of the kind of things that were going on. But in these number of cases, she breaks them down into several different types. She calls them walkabouts, turn-ups, comebacks, flyaways, windfalls, and trade-ins. So I'll just give a brief outline of what these things mean. So a walkabout is something that was in a certain place and then disappears and shows up in a different place. So this might be like you have your keys on a little hook on the wall, and then they disappear, and then they show up like in your storage trunk in your closet, sitting on top a bunch of papers that you'd left there and that you haven't looked at for years, something like that. A turn up is something that shows up at a place where it should be, but that you don't really have any memory of, you haven't seen it disappear from that spot, essentially. So something that you might have noticed has been missing, like when you're looking for like your wallet that you're pretty sure you left somewhere, and you look at the spot and it's not there, and then it shows up in that spot later on. But you never actually had any evidence that it disappeared from that exact spot. You're kind of uncertain about where it was in the first place, but then it shows up where it should be. A comeback is something that shows up, well, exactly what it says. It disappears from one spot and then comes back to that place. That actually reminded me of the missing 411 cases a lot too, where you'll look for something, look for a person in a certain place. For those not familiar with missing 411, that's David Politis' work researching missing persons, often who have disappeared in like national parks, but several like clustered areas in the United States and elsewhere. But the cases all seem to follow a pattern of a person disappearing seemingly out of nowhere, and then oftentimes they'll get search parties out, including getting the canine units to search areas, and you get people like looking for these people and searching places sometimes multiple times, and then they'll find the body there in a place that they know that they've searched, that they've documented that they've searched. That just kind of reminded me of that. The next one is a flyaway, something that just disappears and never comes back. And then a windfall. This is an object that comes from an unknown object, an unfamiliar object that just shows up. Something that you're not familiar with, something that's not yours, that you somehow get. And there's one interesting windfall case that she describes of a lady who was like out in her garden, like dozing off.
In the country.
In the country.
Far away.
Yeah, like the garden was at the back of the house, not visible from the street. It was kind of like an isolated area. And she wakes up and there's a letter, like a postmarked letter, as if the mail person had delivered it and put it on her lap. But it wasn't addressed to her place, so she thinks, well, that's kind of weird. She and her husband look at it and then open it up, and it was a letter from a librarian to some person living in a different county, requesting that they return the books that they've had out for, that they should have returned a month ago or something like that. And that was a really weird one, because then they research this, they call the librarian and send the letter back, and then I think it was the husband wanted evidence for it again, wanted a copy of the letter, so asked the librarian to photocopy the letter, and so the librarian's like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do that. Faxes the letter, but it's a different letter. It's a wrong letter. It's a letter that sequentially would have come after this letter, reminding this person about the previous letter that they hadn't received and hadn't responded to, saying, okay, we really need those books back. So they call up again and say, well, where's the real letter? Because this isn't the one. And the letter's gone. The letter had disappeared from this librarian's office. The librarian couldn't find it in their file cabinet. They couldn't find the carbon copy of the letter. It had just vanished.
And the envelope.
So there are just numerous case after case of these kinds of weird things happening. And I think once you read them, I think unless you, maybe for someone who isn't open to the even the idea of anything parapsychological or paranormal that might come across, they'll just dismiss it out of hand. Oh, well, it must have been something. But when you read these cases, it's a lot of them, they're assuming that these events occurred as described. There's no normal explanation for them.
Well, one of my favorite windfalls is a gentleman who was he had a scooter. He was going somewhere, and apparently there was something about this particular engine that the spark plugs will get gummed up. He's got a spare when the thing conks out. So he changes out the spark plug, puts a new one in, goes down the road. I think he was even heading to his mechanic. And the second one gums up, I think from the oil. And now, like, he's stuck. He's really in trouble because he's on a country road. He's heading to his mechanic. And for some reason, he starts to look around and he spots something white in the grass. And it is a brand new exact spark plug that he needs to get his machine going. And he gets all the way to the mechanic with no trouble.
Yeah, and,
Like-
a couple of the weird things about that were that spark plug was found right where he stopped the motorcycle. So he, it breaks down, he gets off, he looks over, and there's the spark plug. And it was a very specific kind of spark plug too. It's not like a standard one that, someone would just, happen to have dropped somewhere. This was a precise, the precise make and model for his, his scooter or whatever it was.
So there's a little bit of sigh in there too. Why would he stop, or why would the machine break down right there next to the exact thing he needed? Like, really?
Another one that just came to mind was this. I think it was a man who, I can't remember. Well, a person lost their keys, and so the keys disappear, and then the keys reappear, but it was. Oh, maybe you remember this one better than I did.
Yeah, they disappeared, and he goes, screw it. So he goes and has 4 more made. So new keys, very specific. There was a maker's mark on them for some reason. Some keys have codes on them. Distributes them all to his family, puts the new key on the ring, hangs it back up, because these seem to be very methodical people. The next time they took the key ring down, there was the new key and the old key. And the thing that makes this one really freaky is that the old key had a mark. The key looked brand new. The returned key did not show any signs of wear, scratches. You know how keys get kind of beat up after a while. The shop that the original key had been made in had been closed for 2 years. So somehow...
Right, so he calls up. I think he even takes it to this shop where they make keys, and they say, "Oh yeah, well the new shop, like where they'd moved to," and they look and they say, "Well, yeah, that looks like the keys that we made, but that's not our name anymore. That's not our address because this was stamped on the key, and and those models like that key type we haven't used, for 2 years or something." So the keys were replaced, but it was with a new version of the old key. It was as if someone was trying to create a forgery for these old keys, like someone had stolen them and tried to forge to make it look as if they were the old keys, but they were new, and they were like anachronistic in essence. So, and then there's the lady on her vacation with her family in Africa somewhere, and she's got 2 corsets that she wears, and every night, she'd alternate. So she'd wear one corset for one day, take it off, clean it, and wear the next one the next day, and alternate back and forth. And she'd leave the corset on the chair next to her bed. Then one morning she wakes up and her corset isn't there. So she looks all over the place for it, can't find it. No, none of her family can find it. She gets home after the vacation, and there it is in her closet, all tied up. And I don't wear a corset, but but for anyone who has and for this lady in particular, she never would leave it tied up. It's like you tie it up once it's on you because it's a hassle. And so it was just all tied up in her closet. There are a couple cases like that of people, losing something on vacation and then finding it in their home. Like there was one, I think it was a favorite alarm clock. It was just a cheap alarm clock, but it was handy. It worked. It did the job, and so there was some kind of sentimental value attached to this particular alarm clock. I'm pretty sure this was the one that was found, so that missing on vacation again. Then they come home and they find it in the middle of the floor in the entryway of their house, just sitting in the middle of the floor. Yeah. So oftentimes these objects they disappear, and then the way she describes it, and the way that people that find them describe it, is that they're found in a conspicuously obvious place. It's right there to grab your attention. So it's right in the middle of the floor where obviously you might have walked 10 minutes before. Or, you open a chest of, a storage chest where you keep all your knickknacks and stuff and old papers, and this watch that you've been looking for and that you've looked in the chest for is just sitting precisely like right in the middle on top of like all these other things, like in the first example I gave. It's like the way she describes it, it's almost like there's some kind of like, joker or trickster that's like playing a trick on you. It's like, okay, well, here you go. Here it is. Like, this might freak you out.
You've suffered enough. Here you go.
Right.
And this is, if this has been since forever, then this is where you get your stories of mischievous fairies and, not annoying the brownies because they will steal your favorite milk churn or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and people, if they're not alert, one thing that she mentioned in passing is that, and she qualified it, is that this seems to happen more to people who are paying attention. So psychical researchers, she gives a lot of examples from folks who were part of her research group. But then you could make the argument that people aren't paying attention when it happens. They write it off. They never think about it. Or, so it might be a very pervasive phenomenon, but only certain people are alert to it. Or does it happen more to them because they are alert to it? You can go round and round about that.
Well, there was actually one, I forgot to describe the last one, a trade-in. So this is where one of your items of one of your personal possessions disappears, and then you find it again, but it's not your personal item. It's like a facsimile of your item. It's a slightly different model than your item. So there were a couple examples of those, like another alarm clock one where a different alarm clock showed up. I can't remember. You lose one earring and then another earring shows up, but it doesn't match the first one or something like that.
Yeah.
So those are the weirdest ones. But that's it for examples. But maybe just one more example. When she gets into, because the first couple chapters are just all the case studies, arranged by type, by those 6 categories that she lumps them into. And then she gives the background, because this is all leading up to kind of her big theory for why this happens. And her big theory ends up being a really big theory, like not just about Jots or Jottles, but about kind of everything. It's kind of like her explanation for this phenomenon is basically her explanation for reality, essentially. Like it's all encompassing. And so to get there as relevant data to explain this phenomenon, she gets into all of the parapsychological research. So you can lump it into 2 categories, ESP and PK, and then subcategories from there. But in the description in that section where she describes all this other research, she references back a couple of these cases. One being a postage stamp that someone was holding it in their fingers, and this person felt the postage stamp dematerialize. So it just felt it like disappearing from within, between his fingers, and that seems to be something. Well, that seems to be what has happened in all these cases, is that when these objects disappear, they actually dematerialize. It's not that they like float up and move around, like you'd find in like the Poltergeist movie or something like that, or even real poltergeist cases. We'll get into that in a second. But something that just pops out of existence. It literally just disappears. And then when it appears, like I don't think there are any examples, aside from the people that have felt the object disappear, there aren't very many examples of people who have seen the object actually disappear and then reappear.
That almost seems to be a characteristic, is that when your attention is momentarily withdrawn, it will pop back into our existence.
But to like the the research and the examples she gives to kind of give the context and the background to fit this into her theory, one of those examples is like I said, poltergeist cases. So these would be cases where there are accounts of objects seemingly moving of their own accord, floating through the air. And she gives some pretty famous and well-documented examples of poltergeist cases of, and apparently this is a pretty common phenomenon in poltergeist cases, is like flying stones. So there are a couple examples of houses being just bombarded with rocks that are being thrown at the house. So people inside the house will hear hear rocks being thrown against their windows and walls from outside. And so initially, some of these cases, the assumption was that there were kids throwing rocks, because the rocks are there, like you can see the rocks that were thrown, but no one's ever found. And then there are some witnesses, I think, including the people that experienced these phenomena, that actually looking from outside, saw the rocks like seemingly materializing out of nowhere and then shooting at the house. So if you're to look at it, 2 feet away from the house, you'd see a rock appear and just shoot out, against towards the house and against the window or the house.
Well, wasn't there also a case? I'm not sure it's related to that particular one of these 2 kids who were getting pelted with rocks, and you would see the stones falling around them, but they were never hurt. Mm-hmm. It's almost like they didn't become solid within, I don't know, the field of these 2 kids. And when they went inside the house, the stones continued to fall on them. Mm-hmm. But they never got hurt from them. So it's like they were materializing, but they weren't hard enough to hurt them.
Yeah, it's like they weren't fully materialized. I think that's the way she describes it.
Right.
So, so by bringing all this stuff up, she kind of, like her theory because this is like what she'd call like a paranormal event, or what people would call a paranormal event. Mm-hmm. And therefore you've got to look at all these paranormal phenomena at the context of all these other paranormal phenomena in order to be able to, in order to explain one, you have to account for all of them, essentially. Mm-hmm. At least that's kind of the direction she goes in. So so at the end, maybe can you give me the copy of that book there? I'm going to just read a couple things from the end. First, like when she finally gets to her theory, she points out that it basically revolves around one central point, she says, and that is probability. So she writes about the ruling principles. So the principle that probability is inherent in the world means that in default mode, the most probable event will always occur. The most probable event in our perceived reality is determined by another default mode, the causal directive, which requires the most probable sequence of events to be consistent with causality, so that every event follows preceding events in a coherent sequence. So it's just kind of laying out that like some grand, like some first principles on the nature of reality, and these actually are have a lot in common with process philosophy, Whitehead's philosophy. He basically called, I can't remember what he called his word for the causal directive was, but it was basically the part of like the process that would apply to everything from some subatomic particles up to what we can perceive like humans' minds, your essence, your individuality, which is self-reproduction, and that this accounts for the stability of the world. Is that an inherent part of the process of reality is that the thing in itself reproduces what it was just previously. So like in a quantum system, a particle will in its quantum evolution from one state to another state, there will be a reproduction of that previous state. Like that is, the previous state is the like the benchmark or like the starting point for the evolution to the new state. It's not like something completely changes from one instant to the next. There is a continuity, and it is a reproduction of what has happened in the past. Mm-hmm. And that reproduction is basically what accounts for not only the stability of the universe and the coherence of the universe, but it's the reason things, it is the similarity that underlies any change in a system. Like that's why you can recognize yourself from one day to the next. That's why, mm-hmm. one apple that you eat is the same apple that you were eating a split second before. It's like there is some principle in the universe, in like the very basic causality of the universe, that preserves the past within the present, and so the present contains the past within it. And on top of that, though, is the introduction of novelty, which Whitehead that was like one of the most important things to explain, to account for, is the emergence of novelty, because in a deterministic world. Of a billiard ball world of strict determinism, nothing new can enter into it because everything is just operating on the all there is stability and reproduction of the past. So there needs to be an element that brings in something new. And the place to look for that, I think, would be in probability. It's because things don't just reproduce themselves; they reproduce themselves, but there's like a branching, like a tree, like a series of branches of potential futures, and each future will have a probability. So again, in quantum mechanics, it's like there's the probability. There's a probability like distribution of possible states and positions or whatever of like an electron or something, and it will probably find itself in this position, but there's a lesser probability it'll find it in that position. And this has all been determined by experiment where they've looked at these things and like calculated the probabilities. Oh well, based on all these observations that we've made, here are the probabilities of positions for this electron in this particular system, and that is what kind of allows for the introduction of novelty, I think, because if everything's probabilistic, well, there's a very small chance that something new will happen, something out of the ordinary. And this reminded me of something that I can't remember his first name. His last name's Gell-Mann. I think he's the guy that discovered the quark, quantum physicist. And in his book, I think it was in one of his books, he described how, as an undergraduate, his professor had got him to calculate the probability that an object, like a macroscopic object, like a chair or a person or a dog, would instantaneously like jump, or not jump, but just appear 1 foot above where it should have been. So you just automatically find yourself 1 foot in the air, and then you fall back down again. And the probability was something like 1 over 10 to the power of 60, which is I haven't done the math, but that's actually pretty close to the probability that Douglas Axe gave for finding a functional protein, randomly. I think that was like 1 in 10 to the 70, which is actually much more exponentially more difficult. But well, even that in itself is pretty interesting. That the probability of randomly finding, like, I think it was like 150 amino acid protein sequence is vastly more improbable than finding yourself a foot in the air, from 1 second to the next. But because apparently, I guess using the the Schrodinger equation, I think that's the one that they use, that that can happen. That's part of the probability. The probability is inherent in these quantum processes that an electron can conceivably, though very improbably, find itself at some other part in the universe. Could be a foot away, could be a light year away, but and the further away, presumably, the more unlikely it is. But there's still a chance, right? It's
Yes.
like Dumb and Dumber. It's like might be a 1 in a million chance, or a 1 in the trillion, whatever to
But
the
it
X
could
degree.
happen.
But it could happen. But there's a chance. So so she actually talks about quantum physics. She's not a quantum physicist, and just I myself, like I said in the previous show, I don't like talking about quantum physics because I know I'm not, I don't know enough about it to be able to talk about it. And I think that's what most people are. So most people should just probably shut up when it comes to quantum mechanics because they don't really know what they're talking about, myself included. But she also gets into that, of course, because most people, you can't not talk about it, I guess, when you're talking about something like this. So
She does give a nod to that, but
yeah.
she figures, actually, her riposte to that was, I will talk about quantum physics as expressed to me through television programs and whatever, as scientists talk to me, having not researched my field, and consider it even.
So the idea here could be just like, even just, if Gell-Mann is correct, and if that's a correct interpretation of quantum physics, that there is at least a chance that an object can just reappear spatially displaced from where it was previously, even if it's a tiny probability like that. If it's possible, then it might be able to account for these phenomena. At least it creates the possibility that is possible. The possibility that that's possible, because
It allows.
it allows for it. It's at least it seems to be something that might conceivably happen in the universe as we know it, as it's structured. And so it's just very improbable. And
if the universe was left to itself.
Right. So this is where I can't remember if she actually mentions it in this last chapter, but it's relevant to the previous chapter. So this is where I'm going with this. In the examples she gives of like I think she calls it like methodological experimentation of like psychokinesis, for example. These are the tests that parapsychologists do using like random number generators and things like that, where it seems like one interpretation of all of those results is that it seems that people with minds are able to somehow mess with the probabilities of things. So like using these random number generators, for instance, some of the tests that they do should give results that converge on like 50%, heads or tails, essentially, flipping a coin, but in this case, a digital coin. But when they do these tests, they find that when you're first doing tests, you might get 3 heads and 1 tail, right? So it's like it's not close to 50. But the more trials that you do, the closer the results converge on 50-50. Mm-hmm. But in the PK experiments that they do, they find that even after especially after multiple results, like thousands and thousands of trials, you might get like 51%. So the probabilities have actually been shifted. They're getting more heads when they should be they should be getting more even heads and tails. That's just basically like a simple description of what the kind of the math of what they're doing. And then if you look at even something like genetics, like protein sequences, or the amino acids that make them up, like extremely improbable sequences of code, essentially, or just so we've got, just keep that in mind, like amino acids making up proteins. There's a similar phenomenon in that we utilize every day in just writing or computer code, because every time you write a paragraph or a computer code, a stretch of computer code, you're actually embedding like information in whatever substrate you're using that is vastly improbable. If you just look at if you look at the letters or the amino acids or like the characters that you're typing when you're typing some computer code, the sequence that you end up with is vastly improbable. And you can approach improbabilities, ranging, or you can approach improbabilities comparable to those of the object jumping a foot in the air, mm-hmm. or the 150 amino acid sequence, basically hitting that bullseye. Every bullseye is a vastly improbable event when you compare it to just randomness, just whatever randomness is, but just an unguided process, an unintelligently guided process. Mm-hmm. So again, with the example of typing, it's like you put a monkey or just a random, if you could devise a machine that would type randomly, you will not get anything that makes sense. You'll get just you'll get a random sequence of letters. You won't get Shakespeare, for instance, mm-hmm. To use the cliche. But when you mathematically analyze a text, in comparison with that ideal random process, the text, your meaningful text is extremely improbable. That seems to be what consciousness does, is that it's an improbability. What's the Hitchhiker's Guide? The improbability engine. In the machine, in the ship that Beeblebrox or whatever his name is steals.
It's an improbability drive.
The improbability drive. Yeah, that's right. Our consciousness is inherently an improbability drive because it is constantly doing things that are vastly improbable. Mm-hmm. Because simply for the reason that we're choosing it. Like that is the nature of creativity, of mind, of just, well, arguably, like Barrington might say, of just the universe itself. This is built into the universe, this kind of process. So we have these things going on in the world that are kind of following that principle of, what does she call it, causal directiveness or whatever, the self-reproduction of the stability. But every once in a while, it's like things kind of go haywire a bit. Mm-hmm. It's like instead of following the most probable event, we followed like one of the least probable events. And and she would argue this isn't an accident. It's not like this is just. She's not arguing that this is just something about the universe. Like every once in a while, there's just like a cosmic hiccup, and your pen forgets where it should have been and just appears everywhere. Because one of the features of these JOTT cases is that the objects disappear as objects, as we conceive of them.
Yes.
Because like when
Well, I was going to say, for starters, she does head off in the direction of trying to find an underlying motive for that. The idea that these events are not random on some level. The loss of the pen, the return of the pen, the whatever. She never quite goes there. But this idea of consciousness being involved. Let me know if I'm heading off in the same direction as you. Is that the appearances and disappearances are what I call units of conception. And she gives the example. This one was priceless. This guy had a gas stove, and he kept the matches to light this gas stove. So I guess it was a really old gas stove in a particular box next to his stove.
Well, just let me add a detail there.
Okay.
He had 2 boxes of matches, right? He had the box of matches, and he had the box where he put the. Maybe this is a different case, but the one I remember is that he had a one matchbox with the matches, another matchbox with the used matches that he'd put them in.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, he's got that, and there was something unusual about this box. It wasn't like just the box the matches came in. It was the box he kept the matches in. So I was picturing some kind of old silver box or something. So he goes to light his stove one day, which he does every day. And the box, he reaches for the box, it is not there. So he gets all annoyed, and he goes and finds another, bit of paper and another match, and he lights the stove, and then he looks back, and the box is back exactly where it was. But the interesting thing about it is that the box as a unit disappeared. It wasn't like the box disappeared and there was a pile of wood matches sitting there, or the matches disappeared. And there's a lot of components to this box. There was the box, the matches, whatever chemicals were on the matches, but they disappeared as a unit, as his concept, my box of matches. So, yeah.
Right, and that would apply. That applies to all of these cases and all of the objects in these cases, because there isn't one example of half of an object disappearing, or something like. Somehow like
the laces from the courses.
Right, right. And even that, this relates back to a concept that Jordan Peterson used to talk about. I haven't mentioned him talk about it recently, but especially in his, the debate that he did with Sam Harris about perception, or the example that he gives is of perception. It's like it's not like you have this screen of consciousness, and then all these objects are just beaming themselves at you, and you see the objects. It's like, no, there is he brings this up in the context of like AI and trying to train AI to see things, and they found out, the researchers involved in this, that it was actually very difficult, because when you're presented with like a visual field, there's nothing inherent about any of those lines or colors or shapes in that field to distinguish one object from the next. The reason that we distinguish objects from each other is because of their meaning to us, but because of their usefulness to us. But if you were to just be have no senses whatsoever for your entire life, and then all of a sudden be given vision, it's like you wouldn't be able to make any sense of what you're looking at. The reason that things make sense is because of our experience with them and because of the meaning that we've attached to those things. But if you were to just make like a pixel by pixel image, like to nature, to an unintelligent, unminded nature, if you can imagine such a thing, a visual image is just a collection of colored pixels. There's nothing. You need consciousness. A directed consciousness and with attention in order to arrange, in order to see the whole of, some of those pixels.
And a conceptual framework to place it in.
Right. Otherwise, it's just random pixels.
Right.
You need a mind in order to conceive of what you're looking at. So, it was a good term you used for, these are whole conceptions of an object. And so that's how these objects behave. If there wasn't some kind of mind involved, if this was just a random process, you would think that it would be more random, because there's nothing inherent about that object to hold it together as an object.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a random collection of atoms. Essentially, it's like when you have a dead piece of wood outside in your yard. It's like there's nothing to distinguish that dead piece of wood from that dead piece of wood when you cut off like a few cubic inches of it. It's still just a dead piece of wood, but the whole thing itself would disappear in a JOTT case.
Mm-hmm.
It's your entire watch that disappears, not just one of the knobs or some of the gears, or just like a random. If you could imagine like a random collection of atoms and molecules from it, so you might just get dust or something, or some little pieces of it that are just barely recognizable as a watch. It's like, no, the whole watch disappears and then comes back. Mm-hmm. So it disappears in the context of the conceptualization of that object. And this relates to to many of the cases where she argues that there seems to be like an emotional motivation for the phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And this is something that Stephen Browdy, a philosopher and parapsychologist, is adamant about in his books. Is that it's one of the most neglected aspects of parapsychology is the actual motivation involved, the kind of the psychodynamics, mm-hmm. the emotional importance and meaning involved in all of these, in any case of like some kind of paranormal event.
Yeah, I think the only time that's ever really considered is in poltergeist cases.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, usually it's aggression or anger unexpressed, or, usually it ends up being that. She talked about one famous case of, this was back when you had servants and bells to call the servants, where the bells were going off all times of the day or night, even bells that had been disconnected from the wiring system. And as far as they traced it all back to a young 14-year-old girl, so adolescent, prime poltergeist instigation situation, who was very resentful of how much the bells were going off and feeling overworked and angry about it. And so, but that's the thing, is that none of these cases, to me, even the simple ones about keys, somewhere along the way there was an emotional reason, there was a motivation to make it happen. Mm-hmm. Or have it happen, or allow it to happen, or open up the possibility of it happening. And I think they'd probably get a lot further along if you would start looking at that and looking at the fact. I mean, I think the whole thing is that they want to keep it very scientific. So you want to keep the emotion, you want to keep the idea that other than it being an interesting event, that there could be a mental influence on the whole thing. I mean, that would just hoop the whole causality thing right out of it.
Yeah. Well, maybe I want to read a couple more things, because we haven't talked about much in the last chapter, which is the most interesting part. But
theory of everything.
Yeah. So maybe just, like I said, she talks about unconscious volition. She brings that into it. So that's actually really relevant to the things we've been talking about the show in recent months, like James Carpenter's work and then Bernardo Kastrup. And of course, Whitehead and Griffin and those guys. But then she gets to this, which, I just got to say, whether her theories are correct or not, she's a, how do I describe it? A very unique and adventurous thinker. You'll see that when I read some of these things. Where am I going with this? Yeah. So this is under the section, The Forces of Law and Order. Probability laws and the causality directive imply a lawmaker. This thought trails with it visions of commandments inscribed on tablets and bearded prophets. Commandments inscribed on bearded prophets? Well, no, I don't think she meant that. Entirely in the realm of speculation, I see probability as built into the cosmos rather than imposed on it. And the causality directive belongs some way down the hierarchy of mind layers that is soon to be proposed. It will come as no surprise that I am leading up to positing an all-embracing cosmic mind as fundamental. And furthermore, I am prepared to assert that all reality, universe existence, past and future potentialities, everything, everywhere, is embraced within the cosmic mind, which has no beginning or end. If something has a beginning, something must have preceded it, and if it has an end, something must come after it. Given that there is something, even if that something is an illusion, whatever that would mean, something cannot become nothing. There can be no such thing as nothing. I'd roughly agree with that. And then she gets to this, which is, I kind of, my eyes kind of opened a bit wider than usual when I read this because I just read Bernardo Kastrup and we just talked about him on the show when I happened to read this. So then she has a section titled Dissociation. If our little selves are contained within the cosmic mind, what is our position and status? The obvious relationship is that of a very small cell in a very large brain, or perhaps a smaller, atomic-sized cell fragment of a cell. We could continue down what appears to be a scale of the infinitely small, so small that relationship is hardly the word or the concept. Though it is a frankly anthropomorphic model, and if we were talking about minds, is that not inevitable? I am proposing a hierarchy of minds. Our own creator, author, dreamer, maker, having the same sort of position in relation to the cosmic mind as our planet has to the center of our universe, peripheral rather than at the core. We are, of course, talking at this point about a kind of dissociation. The cosmic mind, according to the thesis, while having the potential to be fully integrated, is always dissociated to some degree. The dissociated personalities of the first order may or may not be further dissociated, and so on down to the level of human personalities. And I'd say perhaps further down to the level of like atoms even. Mm-hmm. As we have seen, humans can also be dissociated, but only when in a pathological state. And a similar principle may hold for entities higher up the pyramid than ourselves, but low enough down to be our maker and progenitor. It is the entities with a problem that dissociate. So it should come as no surprise that, according to the thesis, our world, including the universe in which it appears to be set, is the dream drama of a maker with problems. We are made in his image. Skipping a bit, though an undermined in the larger scheme, he is, that is our maker, in relation to us, his alters, an overmind, more of a queen bee than a pearl, a source of honey but with a sting, more of a dark well than a source of light. Rather than attaching too humanoid a label to an entity that, based on the evidence all around us, may be ruthlessly in control or a regretful witness of unforeseen consequences arising from primordial decisions, he will continue to be called neutrally the maker, author, generator, and participant in our world, and we are his alters, the stuff his dreams are made of. We are part puppets, part actors, part characters in a fiction, part autonomous creatures. How's that for a thesis?
Well, it doesn't go without precedent. I mean, that's the Hindu view of Brahman, that Brahma has fallen asleep and is dreaming, and we are the Maya, the dream of.
But who is the dreamer?
Who is the dreamer? Yes.
Right.
But it's certainly got some merit. I mean, I don't. Looking around, you would say, yeah, pathological. Pretty sweeping stuff.
Yeah. Well, maybe one more quote.
Oh, please.
On the cosmic mind thing. So this is under the heading "Cosmic Justice?" ? These speculations on time, space, and elsewhere lead us back to the all-embracing cosmic mind in which everything that ever has been or will be exists. The infinite possibilities lighting up in sequences in the same way that a musical work, though complete, has to be experienced note by note. I find that I have to cling to the idea, she's just getting into, I'll skip that bit actually. So, we are all the maker's creatures, with many of his unfortunate character traits, but we have a sense of influences more benign at some level that transcend the values written into the laws of nature. This must be an awareness of higher levels in the hierarchies of the cosmic mind, so that the ferocity and ruthlessness built into the creatures of the maker from white cells, microbes, and viruses upwards are modified by altruism, sympathy for our prey, and regret at our own predatory role in the in the natural order. Assuming that these higher influences predominate in the cosmic mind, we have to ask, among other unanswerable questions, if some great purpose is served by the existence of less benign entities that are prepared to precipitate dream dramas that cause distress and suffering to their participants. Skipping a bit. The dreadful truth is that action, to be interesting, brings with it tension and trouble, and it is difficult for us to envisage how things could be different. Skipping a bit. Some viewers might even call for our maker to be struck off the role of world makers, though some sophisticated and liberal voices might defend the necessity of for such disturbing worlds to exist, and that we have a part to play, even a necessary role, in the wider scheme of things. Skipping. We may also have a therapeutic role. We must bear in mind that the sorrows of our world are shared by our Maker, who in his states of partial awareness and insight may be resolving his conflicts. So essentially, we are like the disturbed pathological alters of a being with
Issues.
with issues, with serious dissociative issues, and so our working out the problems are actually working out the problems of this higher overmind that is encompassing us.
I found that a really interesting idea, because what are we all striving for theoretically but to make ourselves whole, and in creating our own wholeness, adding to the wholeness of however high up the ladder you want to go.
And then maybe one last bit. There remains, among other unfathomable mysteries, the question of why the cosmic mind, which could be entirely integrated and exist in one eternal state of total perfection, should be always in a state of dissociation. As we have seen, activity imports stress, so why should the cosmic mind choose to be permanently stressed? And I don't think she actually answers that, but I think it's a question to, that's the question, right? And so that's why I said she's kind of got a big scope in her explanation for disappearing objects.
It's a long way from lost keys.
Yeah, because these are really, she's managed to, I think, didn't she write another book? It's not listed in here, but I had the impression that I think it was a different person.
No, she wrote one in 2016.
Yeah, but
I can't remember the title of it.
Yeah, she did. With Ian Stevenson, the reincarnation research guy, and another guy, A World in a Grain of Sand. That's I can't remember who said that. It's a famous quote, some poet or something.
Walt Whitman.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. And what she's essentially done, so the Jot has been her grain of sand, and she's found the universe in it. The widest and grandest mysteries of the cosmos she's found in disappearing keys, which is it's quite a feat.
It's very poetic.
Yeah, and but so in the process, she's dealing with the question of evil, the existence of evil in the world, and just basic philosophical questions on the nature of reality. So the nature of being and existence and existentialism, and it's all implicated in there. And that would be the case if we live in a coherent, ordered cosmos. Is that any one bit will contribute to the interpretation of all other bits, because they're all part of a unified whole on some level. So it's a valid direction to go in, I think. Did you want to say something? No? Okay. Well, I just wanted to bring up a couple. Maybe kind of connections for the stuff that she was writing. So this the idea of dissociation. This is in the last show that we did when we talked about Kastrup's book. I mentioned that. I'll give the picture that's forming for me now. I think that one of the problems of the scientific worldview, the materialistic worldview, is to look at kind of basically the hardcore physicists see subatomic particles and processes as the ultimate bits of the universe, the ultimate bits of reality. Everything can be explained in terms of those quarks and electrons and gluons and all those things. And so everything else kind of is lesser relevance and importance than those physical bits. So it's like the trillions and trillions to the nth degree of little things. That's all there is to reality.
Right. And everything beyond, everything above that can be built from whatever's going on at that level.
Right. And the problem that Kastrup has with materialists, or one of the problems, is that well, not necessarily with materialists, but with materialists and with panpsychists. Like so the people that would say that there are that all of those little bits are conscious, and that explains consciousness. Like he argues in modern philosophy, one of the problems with that is, well, what is the principle that explains why combinations of those like conscious bits have their own consciousness? It's like, so why aren't we just a collection of trillions of conscious atoms? Why do we seem to have our own consciousness that unifies all those things? That seems to be an additional principle on top of that. Well, so it seems like to me that a better explanation is to combine like the two views. You have like all the little bits that combine in shapes and to become, you know, bigger macro objects. But you also have like the cosmic mind, the unified whole of the cosmos that dissociates to ever smaller bits. And so you have to look at it from two directions as opposed to just one.
We almost wonder if there isn't some sort of tacit agreement to work together, that the larger consciousness looking to have an experience, because that's what the universe is about, is experiences, and drawing experiences from it, would have an agreement with these lesser consciousnesses that wish to experience a larger existence, so to speak. And so that there's this interplay, this agreement that, okay, I will guide and inform and, you know, allow for you, smaller consciousness, to have this larger experience, and in hopes that you will learn whatever it is that some liver cell needs to learn, you know. That always seemed to make sense to me, that there's this ever striving upward for more and more complexity from I mean, as far as right now, I would think even electron has some sort of consciousness and some sort of striving. So when presented with an opportunity by a molecule to be something,
Part of something.
why
greater.
not? You know, so there's this drive for affiliation and unification, but not in the idea of losing what you've had before.
And yeah, so it seems to me that like marriage, that handshake that between like all the little bits and all the overarching bits is just the way the universe is structured. We live in a universe where that is the way things are. That's the way beings are. Is that like a being is like a combination in some sense of a bunch of smaller beings, and it is an atom in some larger being. Its consciousness is like a dissociated alter of some larger consciousness. And one of the things I liked about Barrington's take on this is that she acknowledges that that kind of excluded ground between the ultimate and humanity. Like, so I've said this on the show several times before. Is it seems that's the taboo area. From not only from materialists, but from the kind of you know, consciousness-oriented people who are, you know, not materialists. Is that okay? So we have, well, and it's the same thing even in some religious communities, some Christian communities that see like essentially humanity as the apex of God's creation, and then above that there's God.
Throw in a few angels along the way.
Yeah, but maybe even not. Like some like Christian traditions have even like don't even like really consider angels as real things. But so there's this, but she at least acknowledges those possibilities as like higher like dissociations within dissociations, and like a level of consciousness between us and the cosmic mind, the ultimate. That there. So the picture up there, the landscape might be a lot more complex than we can even imagine. That there's a lot going on up there that might need to be taken into account if we want a full account of and description of reality and our place within it. So anyways, I think we gave a good enough introduction to this book. So yeah, if you're interested in parapsychology and some far out speculations on the nature of reality, then yeah, I recommend checking it out because it's actually
Show the book again.
it's a pretty entertaining book. So yeah, there you go.
It's short. It is very entertaining, and the way she goes from the sand to the universe is quite something.
Yeah.
It's very charming.
All right. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you later.